I've heard some people say that the past is the key to the present. Is that the case when it comes to science-faith conflicts? Can we learn from church history when it comes to how we should approach perceived conflicts between science and the Christian faith? I'm joined today by Dr. Gavin Ortlund, who is a Christian scholar and a pastor and an expert in church history to unpack some of these issues. Gavin, in previous episodes, we've been talking about how valuable church history is for helping us to appreciate the complexity of interpreting Genesis 1, or how the studying church history can expand our understanding of the doctrine of creation. Finally, you argue that church history can teach us a little bit about humility as we approach these issues. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's, I think, important to define that, because some people hear humility and they think just a general softness or openness, just kind of being deferential. And that's not what I'm thinking of so much, for example, with St. Augustine, who we've talked about and who I think modeled humility well. And Augustine was not, just vague about things. Humility didn't just mean, well, he's just really open-minded and always considered everything. But it did mean that he made a kind of principled distinction between what he would have called the rule of faith, and that is essential orthodox doctrines that, that are, for example, encapsulated in like the Apostles' Creed, and then peripheral things that aren't as important. And he was very self-conscious about wanting to make that distinction. And you can see that as he's, going through his commentary on Genesis, dealing with different verses. And I just love the fact that he's very frequently willing to say, I don't know, or he's very willing frequently to say, well, here's what we should say. We have to say from this verse. But here's a couple options for how we could understand this part of it. And he makes that kind of distinction, whereas sometimes you hear people talking as though we should be certain about everything. On the other hand, you hear people talking as though we shouldn't be certain about anything. And Augustine makes that distinction between the orthodox central truths and the peripheral truths that aren't as important. And he's very careful to have a kind of proportionate amount of certainty for the different areas. But the other thing that's on my mind when I'm thinking about humility from church history is just times where we haven't done it that well as the church. And we've mentioned before the rise of heliocentrism in the 16th century. And I think what is most kind of impressed on my mind from that is the way people I respect, like John Calvin or Martin Luther, or some of these great leaders of the Protestant Reformation, were pretty tough on Copernicus, and they were pretty harshly critical of him for heliocentrism. And Calvin especially was harsh on heliocentrists. And you can understand, if you try to get back in their mindset at that time in history, why they would have struggled to accept geocentrism. It is a counterintuitive change. They had a lot of historical pedigree on their side. And there's a lot of verses that look like they might be saying geocentrism. Psalm 93 verse 1 says, the earth shall never be moved. Psalm 104 verse 5 says the same thing. They all appealed to Joshua 10, where the sun stands still. There were arguments they made from the Bible, but obviously today, very few of us, if any, there are some geocentrists around today. They're very rare, but most of us would recognize we didn't do that well as the church, Roman Catholic and Protestant. We should have had greater humility about our interpretations of Scripture. I believe that the Bible is infallible, and it is never wrong, but I do think that our interpretations of the Bible are sometimes wrong. And in those cases where we're dealing, again, Augustine, peripheral, where we're dealing with things that aren't, in the Apostles' Creed, I think we need to be careful to listen to science. Not subserviently, just bowing down immediately, but really considering the claims. In the case of the rise of heliocentrism, that could have really helped us not pounce on Copernicus, but to say, well, what's the evidence here? Is there a strong case to be made? And I think there's a kind of balanced, more measured outlook that we need to model today of holding fast to the truth of Christianity, affirming the authority of Scripture, but also making distinctions between the central and the peripheral and listening carefully to what scientific claims are, and at the very least, not responding in a dismissive way before we've really engaged the evidence.